The millionaire didn't want to dance with anyone until the poor cleaning lady walked in. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. The ballroom at Greyfell was a tomb of crystal and cold marble. Its chandeliers, hung like frozen tears, had not been lit in 5 years, their prisms gathering a fine, almost reverent layer of dust. The man who owned the house, Alistair Finch, stood at the far end of the room, his reflection a fractured ghost in the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the valley. The wind, a constant, mournful presence, pressed against the glass as if trying to get in, to scour the last remnants of memory from the cavernous space. Alistair was a man made of silence and sharp edges, his fortune as vast and empty as the landscape his mansion dominated. He had come to this place with a wife whose laughter, it was said, was the only thing that could ever quiet the wind. Since her death, he had simply let the wind win. He existed within the walls of Greyfell not as a master, but as another fixture, as permanent and unmoving as the granite mantelpieces. His days were a ritual of solitude, a slow march through rooms that still held the faint, imagined scent of her perfume, the echo of her footsteps on the stairs. The town below spoke of him in whispers, a tragic figure, a recluse, a millionaire whose money could buy the mountain, but not the warmth to survive its winters. He did not want warmth. He wanted the cold, the silence. He wanted the world to leave him to his grief, a kingdom he ruled with absolute, desolate authority. Into this kingdom of dust and sorrow came a woman named Clara. She was not sent for, not invited. She was a necessity, hired by Alistair's stern, efficient housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, who had finally deemed the encroaching dust a battle she could no longer fight alone. Clara was what the town called fallen on hard times, a polite term for a woman who had lost everything. Her husband, a stonemason, had been taken by a fever that swept through the quarry workers' camp, leaving her with his meager tools, a pile of debt, and a quiet, unyielding dignity that the town found both pitiable and irritating. She arrived at Greyfell on a raw autumn morning, the wind whipping her thin coat around her like a prayer. The house loomed over her, not just a building, but a cliff face of grief. Mrs. Croft met her at the servants' entrance, her eyes a quick, dismissive inventory of Clara's worn boots and mended dress. "The master does not like to be disturbed," the housekeeper said, her voice as crisp as a dead leaf. "You will be silent. You will be invisible. Your work is to erase the passage of time." "Understood." Clara simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Her first days were a blur of cold water, harsh soap, and the monumental task of bringing a shine back to surfaces that had forgotten the sun. She moved through the grand, empty rooms like a ghost, her footsteps muffled on the thick carpets. She dusted the frames of portraits of a woman with a smile that could break your heart, her eyes full of a light that was now extinguished. She polished silver that would never be used for a dinner party. She scrubbed floors that would never feel the scuff of dancing shoes. She was as instructed, invisible. Alistair was a rumor, a shadow. She would hear the distant creak of a floorboard above her, or see a flicker of lamplight in a far window late at night. He existed in the periphery, a silent, brooding presence that was the source of all this desolate grandeur. One afternoon, while polishing the glass doors of the library, she saw him for the first time. He was standing by the fireplace, staring into the unlit hearth, his back to her. Even in stillness, he seemed to radiate a cold, coiled energy. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a tailored black coat, but he held himself with a stoop, as if carrying an immense, unseen weight. She froze, her hand still on the polishing cloth, her breath caught in her chest. He must have sensed her, because he turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers in the reflection on the glass. His eyes were the color of a storm-tossed sea, deep, turbulent, and utterly exhausted. There was no curiosity in them, no acknowledgement of her as a person. He looked through her, as if she were just another part of the dusty, silent house. Then he turned back to the hearth, and she was dismissed. She fled, her heart hammering. In that one, brief glance, she had seen a loneliness so profound it made her own feel like a shallow pond next to an ocean. That night, in her small, cold room in the attic, Clara lay awake, listening to the wind howl around the eaves. She had come here seeking a wage, a roof over her head, a way to simply survive. She had not expected to walk into the heart of the sadness, so vast it had its own geography, its own bitter, relentless weather. Clara's world shrank to the size of Greyfell, her days dictated by the tyranny of dust and the rigid schedule of Mrs. Croft. The housekeeper was a woman who found solace in order, and she treated the mansion's encroaching decay as a personal affront. She followed Clara through the rooms, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her silence a heavier critique than any spoken word. For Mrs. Croft, Clara was not a person but a tool, a pair of hands to combat the entropy that grief had invited into the house. Clara learned the language of the mansion, the sigh of the old wood, the rattle of a loose window pane in the east wing, the particular way the afternoon sun slanted through the dusty conservatory, illuminating forgotten ferns that had long since turned to brittle lace. She moved with a quiet efficiency that began to satisfy even the housekeeper's stern standards. She learned to be invisible, to anticipate where the dust would settle, to erase her own presence as thoroughly as she erased the grime. Yet, she could not erase the house's profound sorrow. It clung to the velvet drapes and settled in the cold hearths. It was in the stopped clocks and the covered furniture. And it was in the master of the house, Alastair Finch. He remained a spectral presence. Sometimes she would find evidence of his passage. A book left open in the library, a single glass on a side table, the faint scent of cigar smoke in the West Wing study. These small signs of life in the vast, still house were like finding wildflowers in a desert. They were proof that something, however broken, still breathed here. One rainy afternoon, Mrs. Croft assigned her the task of cleaning the grand ballroom. It had been sealed for years, a shrine to the last night it had been used, a charity gala hosted by Alastair's wife just a week before she fell ill. Stepping inside was like stepping into a preserved moment. A single, silver slipper lay abandoned near the base of the grand staircase, as if its owner had simply vanished into the air. The air was thick and still, smelling of dried flowers and regret. In the center of the room, a magnificent grand piano stood silent, its keys hidden beneath a closed lid. Clara ran her cloth over its polished surface, her fingers tracing the elegant lines. On a whim, she lifted the lid. The ivory keys gleamed, perfect and untouched. She had not played in years, not since her father had sold their small upright piano to pay for medicine. But her fingers remembered. Hesitantly, she pressed a single key. The note, a clear, beautiful C, hung in the silent air, a perfect crystalline sound in the suffocating quiet. It was a violation, a sound of life in a room dedicated to death. She quickly lowered the lid, her heart pounding, her eyes darting toward the door, terrified that Mrs. Croft, or, worse, Alastair himself, had heard. But there was only silence. From that day on, the ballroom became her secret. When she knew she was alone, she would slip inside, lift the piano lid, and let her fingers drift over the keys. She didn't play songs, not at first. She just played chords, fragments of melodies, quiet, searching things that were more like musical sighs than compositions. The music was a balm to her own quiet loneliness, a way to speak without words. Unbeknownst to her, she was not always alone. Alastair, drawn by the faint, ghostly music that seemed to emanate from the heart of the house, had begun to listen. He would stand in the shadows of the hallway, hidden from view, his hand resting on the cold wall, and let the quiet, hesitant notes wash over him. It was the first music that had been played in Greyfell in 5 years. His wife, Lillian, had been the one to fill the house with music. She had played the piano with a joyful, effortless grace, and the silence she left behind had been his most constant, painful companion. This music was different. It was not joyful. It was sad, tentative, but it was not silent. It was the sound of a fellow survivor. He never let her see him. He would listen until the last note faded, and then retreat back into the shadows of his own wing, the ghost of a melody haunting his steps. He began to notice her in other ways. He saw the way she spoke to the horses in the stables, her voice low and soothing. He saw the single wildflower she had placed in a small vase on the library mantel. He saw the care with which she tended the neglected rose garden his wife had planted, her hands gentle as she pruned the dead wood, coaxing new life from the thorny, forgotten bushes. These were small, quiet acts of defiance against the decay, against the sorrow. She was not just cleaning the house. She was trying to heal it. He started to leave things for her. A new, warmer cloak appeared in her attic room. A plate of better food, taken from his own table, would be waiting for her in the kitchen in the evenings. He told himself it was a matter of efficiency, that a healthier worker was a better worker. But he knew it was a lie. It was an acknowledgement, a silent conversation. One evening, she was in the library, late, carefully repairing the spine of an old, leather-bound book that had been damaged by damp. She was so engrossed in her work that she didn't hear him enter. He stood watching her for a long moment, her head bent in concentration, the firelight catching the simple, graceful lines of her neck. "That was my wife's favorite," he said, his voice making her jump. She looked up, startled, the book clutched in her hands. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just—" "It's all right," he said, stepping closer. He looked at the careful, precise stitches she had made. "You have a skilled hand. My father was a bookbinder's apprentice before he became a mason," she explained quietly. He nodded, his gaze lingering on the book and then on her. She would have been pleased that it was being cared for. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The roses," he said, without looking back. "They haven't bloomed like that since she was alive. Thank you." And then he was gone, leaving Clara sitting in the firelight, her heart beating a little faster. He had seen her. He had thanked her. In that vast, lonely house, two solitary souls, separated by a chasm of wealth and class, had found a fragile, unspoken connection in their shared understanding of loss and their quiet efforts to mend what was broken. The delicate bridge of understanding between Clara and Alistair was built of silence, shared work, and small, almost imperceptible gestures. A fire lit in the library on a particularly cold evening. A book on horticulture left open on a table near the dormant rose garden. A pot of tea kept warm on the kitchen stove long after Mrs. Croft had retired for the night. These were the words they did not speak. Clara found herself losing her fear of him. The brooding, formidable master of the house was slowly being replaced by the image of a man hollowed out by grief. A man whose gruff exterior was a fortress built to protect a deeply wounded heart. She began to see the life that had once filled Greyfell, not as a haunting, but as a beautiful, tragic history that deserved to be honored, not erased. She started to uncover the furniture in the morning room, letting the sun touch the brocade chairs and polished mahogany for the first time in years. She opened the windows in the conservatory, and the scent of damp earth and living things began to chase away the stale air of decay. Mrs. Croft watched these small acts of rebellion with a tightening jaw, but she said nothing. She recognized the change in her master. The dark, restless energy that had plagued him for years was beginning to settle. He was still silent, still solitary, but the crushing weight of his grief seemed, for the first time, to be lifting, if only by a fraction. The town, however, was not so discerning. Alistair Finch's rare trips to the village became slightly more frequent, and now he was not always alone. He began to insist that Clara accompany him, not as a servant walking behind, but as a passenger on the seat beside him in his carriage. Her presence at his side was a scandal. Clara, in her clean but mended dress, her hands calloused from work, was a stark contrast to the opulence of his carriage and the fine-bred horses that pulled it. The town's elite, particularly the wealthy matriarchs with unmarried daughters, looked upon her with a mixture of scorn and disbelief. To them, she was an opportunist, a schemer who had somehow bewitched the grieving millionaire. Leading the charge of public opinion was a man named Sterling Ashford, a rival industrialist who had long coveted Alistair's influence and land. Ashford was a man who measured worth in dollars and bloodlines, and he saw Alistair's association with Clara as a sign of weakness, a crack in the formidable Finch empire that he could exploit. He began to circulate rumors, his insinuations as venomous as they were subtle. He spoke of Alistair's failing mind, of the poor cleaning woman's mysterious past, of the impropriety that must surely be happening behind the closed gates of Greyfell. The whispers grew into a steady, malicious hum. One afternoon, Alistair and Clara were in town to procure seeds for the spring planting. As Clara was stepping out of the carriage, Ashford and his perfectly coiffed daughter, Beatrice, approached them. Beatrice, a woman who had long considered herself the prime candidate to become the next Mrs. Finch, looked Clara up and down with a contemptuous sneer. "Alistair, darling," Beatrice said, her voice like honey laced with acid. "I see you brought your staff to town. How very democratic of you." Clara felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up her neck, but she stood tall, her gaze steady. Alistair's face, which had been passive, hardened into a mask of cold fury. He stepped between Clara and the Ashfords, his height alone a formidable barrier. "Clara is my guest, Beatrice," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you would do well to remember your manners." Sterling Ashford chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "A guest? Finch, the whole town is laughing at you. Taken in by a common servant. Has your grief finally rotted your sense? Or is she just warming your bed at night?" The ugly words hung in the air. The townsfolk on the street had stopped to watch, their faces a mixture of shock and eager anticipation. Clara felt as if she had been slapped. But before the tears of shame could form, Alistair acted. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took a step forward, and the sheer, cold menace in his eyes made Ashford physically recoil. "You will apologize to the lady," Alistair said, his voice a low, lethal command. Ashford, for all his bluster, was a coward. He saw something in Alistair's eyes that terrified him, the look of a man who had lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. I meant no offense," Ashford stammered, his face losing its color. "The apology is not for me," Alistair said, his gaze unwavering. Ashford turned to Clara, his eyes full of hatred, but his voice was a defeated mumble. "My apologies, miss." "Now get out of my sight," Alistair said, dismissing him with a finality that was absolute. The Ashfords scurried away, the whispers of the crowd following them. Alistair turned to Clara. Her hands were trembling, but her chin was high. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently adjust the collar of her coat, a small, protective gesture that spoke volumes. "He is not worth your anger," he said softly. "I'm not angry," she replied, her voice shaky but firm. "I'm just tired of being invisible." He looked at her, and in that moment, a profound, unspoken promise passed between them. He would make sure the world saw her. On the silent ride back to Greyfell, the chasm of their different worlds seemed to vanish. They were no longer master and servant, millionaire and pauper. They were two people allied against a world that sought to judge and diminish them. That evening, as they sat in the library, the fire casting a warm glow on the room, he looked across at her and said, "My wife's family is pressuring me to host the annual Founders' Day ball. I have refused for 5 years." Clara waited, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "This year," he continued, his eyes holding hers, "I have decided to accept. Greyfell will open its doors once more." He was not just opening the house. He was re-entering the world. And Clara knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that he was not going to do it alone. The news that Alistair Finch was hosting the Founders' Day ball sent a shockwave through the valley. It was all anyone could talk about. Invitations, printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock, were delivered by a stern-faced courier, and their arrival was treated with the gravity of a royal summons. For the valley's elite, it was a sign that the king was finally returning to his throne. For Sterling Ashford and his ilk, it was an opportunity. They saw it as Alistair's attempt to reclaim his social standing, and they were certain that the unfortunate business with the cleaning woman would be swept under the rug, a temporary madness now corrected. They assumed Clara would be relegated to the kitchens, a ghost in the background where she belonged. They were wrong. Greyfell was transformed. For weeks, the house was a hive of activity. A small army of decorators, florists, and caterers descended upon the mansion, and at the center of it all, orchestrating everything, was Clara. Alistair had given her the task. It was a staggering responsibility, and Mrs. Croft had nearly fainted with indignation. But Alistair's word was law. "Clara has a finer eye for beauty than any of you," he had stated coolly to the assembled team. "Her decisions are final." And so, Clara, the invisible cleaner, found herself directing the placement of floral arrangements, selecting linens, and planning menus. She moved with a quiet confidence that unnerved the professionals who were used to dealing with flighty, indecisive society wives. Clara was neither. She was practical, decisive, and had an innate sense of elegance that was simple and profound. She was not trying to recreate the past. She was creating something new. She chose wildflowers from the valley to complement the hothouse roses. She selected music that was elegant but not somber, and she insisted on a menu that was hearty and comforting, not just fussy and French. She was breathing life back into the house, her life, her taste. Alistair watched from the periphery, a silent, approving presence. He saw the way she handled the staff with a firm but fair hand, the respect she earned from the skeptical vendors, the way the house itself seemed to sigh in relief under her touch. He saw a woman who was not just a survivor, but a creator, a leader. The house had been his wife's stage. Clara was making it her home. The night of the ball arrived, a crisp, clear evening with a sky full of stars as sharp as diamond dust. Carriages lined the long, winding drive to Greyfell, depositing the valley's wealthiest and most influential onto the grand stone steps. The ballroom, which had been a dusty tomb, was now a breathtaking vision of light and life. The chandeliers blazed, casting a warm, golden glow on the polished marble floors. Music from string quartet drifted from a dais. Laughter, a sound that had been absent from these walls for half a decade, began to fill the air. Clara was not in the ballroom. She was in the kitchens, overseeing the final preparations, a simple apron tied over her work dress. She had no illusions about her place tonight. She was the architect of this beauty, but she was not a part of it. At 9 o'clock, Alistair made his entrance. He stood at the top of the grand staircase, and a hush fell over the crowd. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his presence as commanding as ever, but something was different. The haunted, weary look was gone from his eyes. He looked, for the first time in years, like a man who was fully present in his own life. He descended the stairs, nodding politely to his guests, his expression courteous but distant. He accepted a glass of champagne, but he did not drink it. He endured the fawning pleasantries of his wife's relatives and the sycophantic greetings of the valley's businessmen. Sterling and Beatrice Ashford were holding court near the fireplace, confident that Alistair's return to society meant a return to their world, their rules. Beatrice, resplendent in a gown of emerald silk, made her way toward him, her smile predatory. "Alistair, my dear," she cooed, laying a hand on his arm. "The house looks magnificent. You've finally come to your senses. Now, everyone is waiting. You simply must have the first dance." Alistair looked at her hand on his arm, his expression unreadable. "You are mistaken, Beatrice," he said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "I'm not having the first dance." Beatrice's smile faltered. "But it's tradition. You are the host." "Indeed," he said, gently removing her hand from his arm, "which means I will dance with whomever I choose." And with that, he turned and walked away from her, away from the glittering crowd, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He walked through the ballroom, his path parting the sea of satin and jewels. He didn't stop until he reached the archway that led to the service corridors. He pushed open the swinging door and stepped into the controlled chaos of the kitchens. He found Clara near the sinks, her back to him, instructing a young kitchen boy on how to properly stack the plates. "Clara," he said softly. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise. An apron was tied around her simple gray dress, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek. "Sir, is everything all right?" He didn't answer. He simply looked at her, at the woman who had mended his books, tamed his horses, resurrected his garden, and filled his silent house with the ghost of music. He saw not a cleaner, not a servant, but the quiet, beating heart of his home. He held out his hand. "They're playing a waltz," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the clatter of the kitchen. "I was hoping you would do me the honor." Clara stared at his outstretched hand, then at his face, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tears sprang to her eyes, blurring the impossible sight of him standing there, in the middle of the kitchen, asking her, the invisible cleaning lady, to dance. She looked down at her work dress, at her calloused hands. "But I'm not. I can't." "You can," he said, his gaze gentle but unwavering. "And you will." Without another word, she untied her apron, wiped her hands, and placed her small, work-roughened hand in his large, strong one. He led her from the kitchens, back through the service corridor, and through the archway into the grand ballroom. The moment they stepped onto the polished marble floor, a collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The music faltered for a beat, the string quartet staring in disbelief. The laughter and chatter died, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. Every eye in the room was fixed on them. Alastair Finch, the wealthiest and most powerful man in the valley, in his impeccable tuxedo, and the cleaning lady, in her simple, unadorned work dress, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, a faint smudge of flour still dusting her cheek. It was a tableau of impossible contrasts, a defiance of every social law that governed their world. Sterling and Beatrice Ashford stood frozen, their faces masks of pure, venomous shock. Mrs. Croft, watching from shadowed alcove, brought a hand to her mouth, her stern composure finally cracking. Clara felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, a physical force that threatened to crush her. She wanted to run, to shrink back into the invisibility that had been her shield for so long. But then she looked at Alastair. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking only at her, his stormy eyes clear and steady, a silent promise of protection. He gently pulled her into the center of the vast, empty dance floor. He placed one hand on her waist, and with the other, he lifted her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. The conductor of the quartet, recovering from his shock, saw the look on Alastair's face and understood. He tapped his baton, and the music swelled once more, a beautiful, soaring waltz that filled the silent room. And they began to dance. Clara was clumsy at first, her work boots awkward on the slick floor. She had not danced in a decade, but Alastair led with a quiet, confident grace. He moved as if they were the only two people in the world, his focus entirely on her. He guided her through the steps, his movements sure and steady, and slowly, her body remembered. Her feet began to find a rhythm. Her posture, which had been stooped with shame, began to straighten. She lifted her head, her gaze meeting his, and in the circle of his arms, the rest of the world melted away. The staring crowd, the glittering chandeliers, the weight of judgment, it all vanished. There was only the music, the warmth of his hand on her back, and the profound, undeniable truth in his eyes. He was not rescuing her. He was choosing her. He was seeing her completely and without reservation. And in doing so, he was showing her to the world not as a servant, but as his partner. As they twirled across the floor, something broke in the crowd. The hard, judgmental silence began to fracture. A few of the older guests, who remembered Lillian Finch and her love for this room, saw the look on Alastair's face and smiled, a genuine, wistful smile. The blacksmith's wife, who Clara had spoken to in town, caught her husband's eye and nodded in approval. They saw not a scandal, but a love story, a quiet, powerful testament to the human heart's ability to heal. Beatrice Ashford, her face pale with fury, turned and stormed from the ballroom, her father scurrying behind her, their social defeat absolute and public. When the waltz came to an end, they stood for a moment in the center of the floor, the final notes of the music hanging in the air. A tentative, then growing, wave of applause broke the silence. It was not the polite, obligatory applause of a society function. It was warm, genuine, and for them. Alistair bowed his head slightly to the crowd, an acknowledgement he had not given in years. Then he turned back to Clara, a small, genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. "I believe," he said, his voice low, and for her alone, "that the garden is not the only thing that has come back to life at Greyfell." He did not release her hand. Instead, he led her from the dance floor, not to the side, not back to the kitchens, but toward the grand glass doors that led out onto the moonlit terrace. He was not hiding her. He was claiming her. As they stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the warmth and the music and the stunned admiration of the crowd behind, Clara felt a tear trace a path through the flower on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow or humiliation. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming joy. The millionaire had not just danced with the cleaning lady. He had danced with her. And in the quiet, starlit sanctuary of his lonely mountain, a new life, built on a foundation of shared sorrow and hard-won dignity, was finally ready to begin.